We didn't plan anything big for the night, just something dumb to kill a few hours. Mark found an extreme Halloween maze out by an empty industrial park and said it would be good for a laugh. It was cheap and close, so Jenna and I went along. The building looked like a forgotten warehouse with a flickering sign nailed crooked over the door. Inside, a bored woman handed us wristbands and a half-dead flashlight. She mumbled the usual warnings about not touching the actors. The air smelled like dust and something damp. The first hallway was narrow, lined with plastic skeletons swinging from wires. Recorded screams echoed through broken speakers. Mark kept cracking jokes about how fake it all looked. Jenna gripped my arm tighter every few steps. It felt like any other cheap haunted house, nothing to worry about. I had no reason to think that stepping deeper inside would turn the night into something I'd keep replaying for the rest of my life. The first level was a maze of black curtains and flashing strobe lights. People in rubber masks jumped at us with plastic chainsaws, yelling through cheap voice changers. We laughed, shoved each other forward, and kept moving. Then we reached a stairwell, glowing with a single red bulb. A tall man in a long dark coat waited at the bottom. His mask didn't look like the others. It wasn't bright or funny, just stretched skin tones and a crooked mouth. He didn't jump or scream. He stared. We started down, expecting some loud scare, but he simply fell in behind us. The sound of his boots on the metal steps followed, slow and steady. Mark grinned at me like it was all part of the act. As we turned a corner, I noticed other actors peeking from behind fake tombstones, eyes locked on him instead of us. They kept their scripted movements, but their faces tightened for a second, like they were trying to figure out if he belonged there at all. The next hallway twisted tighter and darker. The sound of recorded screams cut off suddenly, leaving only the scrape of his steps behind us. Jenna whispered that we should move faster. Mark joked, but even his voice cracked a little. I glanced back and saw the man just a few steps away. The mask hid most of his face, but his eyes were wide, unblinking. I forced a laugh and called back that he was really committing to the role. He tilted his head slightly, but said nothing. The silence stretched long enough to make my stomach knot. We pushed through a swinging door into a room filled with fake fog and hanging chairs. The smell of damp fabric hit hard. He entered right after us, not rushing, just closing the space inch by inch. Every actor we passed stopped their routine to watch him, their fake weapons hanging uselessly at their sides. We found a split in the path and turned left, hoping to lose him. The corridors sloped downward, and the floor turned slick. Chains rattled overhead. Behind us, his boots clicked faster. No more slow steps. Jenna grabbed my arm hard. Mark was a few steps ahead when he slipped on the wet floor. I heard the heavy thud of his body, and then a sharp grunt that cut off quick. I spun back, heart hammering. The man stood over the spot where Mark had fallen, mask tilted forward. Mark was gone. I shouted his name. No answer, just the sound of the man's breathing through the mask. Jenna pulled me forward, and we ran through a crooked hallway with black plastic walls that slapped against our shoulders. Actors in pig masks froze as we passed. One whispered something to another, their eyes wide as they saw the man gaining on us. We burst into a set designed like a butcher shop. Fake meat swung from hooks. The red light made everything look wet. A man followed and finally lifted his mask. His face was slick with sweat, pale and tense. His eyes locked on me, bright and sharp. There was no crazed grin, just a hard focus that felt worse. I backed up until my shoulders hit a cold metal counter. This isn't funny. We're done. He didn't blink. He pulled a heavy black bag from under his coat and lunged. The plastic scraped loud as he shoved it over my head. The smell of sweat and dirt filled my mouth. I clawed and kicked, but his grip crushed the back of my neck. Jenna grabbed a metal prop and slammed it against his shoulder. It bent with a hollow clang, but made him jerk back just enough for me to rip free. He turned toward her with a sharp twist and drew a small pistol from inside his coat. The sound of the slide snapping back was so clear, it felt like the room stopped. I shouted and threw myself forward, but the shot cracked before I reached them. Jenna fell with a hard slap of shoes on concrete, blood blooming across her shirt. He then turned the gun on me, eyes still cold. I ducked behind a fake freezer as another shot punched through the thin wall. Something hot ripped into my calf, and the pain exploded, leaving my leg half dead under me. I dragged myself toward a side door, every breath like broken glass. His boots followed, slow again, each step heavy and deliberate. I slammed through the exit and fell into a hallway lit by harsh emergency lights. A cluster of staff members stood at the far end, their faces drained of color when they saw the blood on me. One shouted, "Gun!" The man came through behind me, gun raised. Shouts and screams echoed off the metal walls. Security guards sprinted in, weapons drawn. He fired once. The shot smacked the wall inches from my head. The guards answered with a burst of gunfire that deafened me. He staggered, dropped the pistol, and collapsed hard against the concrete. Hands grabbed me, pressing cloth to my leg, voices all around, too many to follow. I searched the crowd for Mark or Jenna, but only strangers' faces stared back. The hospital room was bright and smelled like disinfectant. Cops asked questions I barely processed. They told me Mark's body was hidden behind a false wall, broken from the fall down a service shaft. Jenna died before the ambulance could even reach the parking lot. The man had no ID, no ticket, no reason for being there. He had walked in hours earlier, moving with the guests until he found us. They found extra magazines stuffed into his coat pockets. I keep replaying the sound of that bag sliding over my head, the pressure of his grip, the moment Jenna fell. It just doesn't leave.
My neighborhood always was pretty normal on the surface. Trimmed lawns, quiet evenings, and people who waved with fake smiles. The only house that ever caught my eye belonged to Harold Green, an old man everyone avoided. His place stayed dark most of the year, then exploded with Halloween decorations every October. Neighbors called him creepy. Kids whispered that he was dangerous. I thought they were just bored. Harold reminded me of my dad, who loved Halloween before he disappeared when I was 17. Nobody ever found him. Maybe that's why I never joined the gossip about the strange old man down the street. Most nights I saw Harold alone in his yard, fixing props long after midnight. He always nodded when he noticed me watching. I nodded back. It was like we shared something. Like we both kept Halloween alive while everyone else tried to pretend it was just another day. One chilly evening, a week before Halloween, I heard shouting outside. 3 teenagers were throwing eggs at Harold's house and laughing like maniacs. He stood there holding a box of fake cobwebs, too shocked to move. I ran over and yelled at them to cut it out. They scattered when I threatened to call the cops. Harold lowered his shoulders and gave me a stiff smile.
"You didn't have to do that. They're just kids. Forget it."
His voice trembled a little, like he wasn't used to anyone standing up for him. He glanced at his front door, then back at me.
"You like Halloween, don't you?"
"Yeah, I've always loved it." He hesitated and then said quietly,
"Come inside. You should see what I've been working on."
I followed him in, curious and still catching my breath. Inside was spotless, not the dusty mess I expected. Every wall held detailed decorations, bats so realistic they looked ready to move, lanterns that flickered like real fire, and cobwebs stretched with insane precision. It was the most impressive Halloween setup I'd ever seen. Harold watched me study the props with a faint grin. Something in his eyes made me uneasy, but I kept looking around.
"If you think this is good, wait until you see my studio."
He led me down a long hallway. The floor creaked under every step, and the sound echoed until it felt like the house itself was listening. My chest tightened with each step, though I couldn't explain why. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old coins. We reached a heavy door at the end of the hall. Harold pulled a key from a chain around his neck and slid it into the lock. The click was sharp and final, like the sound of a trap closing. He pushed the door open and gestured for me to enter. The room lit up with bright ceiling lamps. Every wall was covered with mounted animals, foxes, owls, bats, each one disturbingly lifelike. Their eyes reflected the light as if they were still alive. I stepped closer to a bat and touched its wing. The skin felt warm and real, not plastic. I tried to break the silence. "Where do you buy these things?" Harold stepped closer, his face calm but unreadable.
"Oh, I don't buy them. I make them."
I forced a weak laugh. "You mean you sculpt them or something?" His voice was low and steady.
"Taxidermy."
The word landed like a brick in my stomach. I turned to the side wall and froze. A human head hung there, skin pale and eyes glassy. My knees buckled as I recognized the scar on the chin. It was my father. The floor felt like it tilted. My stomach lurched and I dropped hard, palms scraping the concrete. Bitter vomit burned my throat as the room spun. Mounted animals and human parts blurred together in a nightmare that wouldn't let me wake up. Harold crouched beside me.
"You're confused. He was special, wasn't he?"
I scrambled backward until my shoulders hit the cold wall. Everywhere I looked, I saw pieces of people, hands arranged like art on shelves, faces stretched like masks. Even the bats weren't props. Tiny bodies shifted beneath the thin wings. Harold stood slowly, his grin widening, though his eyes stayed flat and dead.
"I don't just work on animals. People are more memorable."
My legs finally reacted. I shot up, stumbling toward the door. Harold moved closer, almost casual.
"What are you waiting for? Why are you not running yet? If you want to stay, there's a place for you, right next to your daddy."
I shoved past him with every ounce of strength. His thin frame barely moved, but he didn't chase me. The hallway stretched like a tunnel, while my heartbeat roared in my eyes. I slammed the front door open and burst into the night. Cold air hit me like a bucket of ice. I collapsed on the grass, screaming, "Help! Call the police! Somebody call the police!" Porch lights snapped on up and down the street. Neighbors stepped out, faces twisted in confusion. I pointed at Harold's house, my voice cracking. He killed people! My dad's in there!" Phones came out, fingers dialing. Sirens wailed in the distance. I stayed on the lawn, shaking so hard my teeth clattered. Through the window, I saw Harold sit calmly in a chair like he was waiting for company. When the police burst in, he didn't move. They dragged him out in handcuffs. He looked at me with a small smile.
"I'm old. Wanted to be remembered. Now I will be."
No one else spoke. The neighborhood stood frozen while officers sealed the house. The story spread fast. News vans filled the street for days. Investigators found remains of at least 7 people, each preserved like twisted museum pieces. My father was identified through dental records. Harold confessed without a fight. He said keeping them perfect gave his life meaning. He never made it to trial. His health collapsed within months, and he died in a hospital bed, still smiling according to the nurse who watched him go. Now, every Halloween, Pine Hollow stays dark. I can't bring myself to decorate or even carve a pumpkin. I still love the holiday, but when I close my eyes, I see those mounted faces, especially my father's, staring back. The silence of that house never really left me, and I know it never will. The following story is inspired by the case of Robert Paul Owens, whose body was mistaken for a Halloween decoration. The body was found face down on the lawn of an unoccupied residence used by the police for training on October 10th, 2023. A gardener working in the area mowed the grass around the body, mistaking it for a doll or prop, unaware that it was a real person. Owen's family was shocked by the confusion and demanded answers about the circumstances of his death. Authorities are currently investigating how the man ended up at that location and what happened before he was found. The case sparked outrage over the negligence and macabre mistake that delayed the identification of the body.
The story is based on the case of Ronald Clark O'Brien, known as the Candyman or the Man Who Killed Halloween, an American murderer who poisoned his own 8-year-old son with cyanide in a Halloween candy in 1974. On the night of October 31st, O'Brien handed out contaminated pixie sticks to several children, but only Timothy, his son, consumed the candy and died shortly thereafter. The investigation revealed that O'Brien had planned the crime to collect life insurance on his children, as he was in debt. O'Brien was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death in 1984. The case shocked the United States because it fueled the urban myth of poisoned Halloween candy. I'm Lena. I'm 26, but I was 4 years younger when that happened. I'm going to tell you about the night that burned every memory of Halloween out of me. The worst night of my life. Our house never had drama bigger than a neighbor's barking dog, but for the last year it felt like a trap with doors we pretended weren't locked. My younger brother Ryan had just turned 17. We used to be close. I taught him guitar chords and we'd argue about bad horror movies until sunrise. Then he started shutting everyone out, and the house turned into a quiet waiting room where no one knew what we were waiting for. Ryan stopped eating with us, stopped answering texts, stopped leaving his room except for the bathroom. He built walls for headphones and closed blinds. Mom tried soft talks, Dad tried yelling, but Ryan's door stayed closed. He didn't fight back, he just stared through people like he'd already moved somewhere else. Every time I came home from work and passed his door, I caught fragments of whispers or a burst of quick laughter that didn't fit the silence. It made me feel like I was walking past a cage with something pacing inside. I wanted to knock, but part of me feared what he might say if he opened the door. By late October, our parents were exhausted and angry. They told each other it was a phase. I didn't buy it. I knew Ryan's habits too well. Something worse was brewing, and we were all pretending not to smell the smoke. Halloween landed on a damp Saturday. I was halfway through coffee when Ryan walked into the kitchen like he hadn't spent the last year hiding. His skin looked pale and tight across his cheekbones. His eyes bright in a way that felt chemical. He grabbed a glass of water, stared into it, then started humming a slow, tuneless rhythm while tapping the counter. Mom lit up like it was a miracle, asking if he wanted pancakes. He said nothing. Dad tried a joke about free candy. Ryan tilted his head, almost smiling, and kept humming. I stood by the fridge pretending to check my phone, watching every move. The rest of the day he drifted through rooms, silent one minute and grinning the next. Sometimes he muttered to himself like he was rehearsing a line only he could hear. Our parents were too busy with decorations to notice. I couldn't stop noticing. By dinner time, the table smelled of roasted chicken and buttered vegetables. Ryan sat with his arms stiff at his sides. He stared at the plates as if they were props on a stage. When Dad asked if he planned to hand out candy, Ryan let out a low laugh that ended as a cough. The sound crawled straight down my spine. The room felt ready to snap, like the air was stretched thin and waiting for a signal. I kept watching his hands. He didn't pick up a fork. He just tapped the table in an odd pattern while grinning at nothing. I decided to find out what he'd been hiding. I pushed my chair back and forced a casual voice. "I need to use the bathroom." Mom barely nodded. Dad kept eating. Ryan's head turned slowly, his eyes locking on me long enough to make my stomach tighten. Walking down the hallway, every floorboard seemed louder than it ever had. I kept thinking he might follow me, that I'd feel a breath at my neck before I reached his room. I stopped outside his door and listened. Nothing. The handle felt cold as I turned it. The room smelled of dust and something sharp, almost metallic. His computer screen glowed in the dark. On one tab, a Wikipedia article about Ronald Clark O'Brien, the Candyman. Another window showed a forum deep in the web with instructions for mixing poisons into food. My eyes scanned the desk. Empty pill bottles lay scattered across a stained notebook. Powder clung to a measuring spoon. Next to the keyboard sat a plastic container of bright blue liquid with no label. I felt heat crawl up my neck as I realized this wasn't a joke or a phase. I heard a slow creak behind me. Ryan stood in the doorway, shoulders relaxed, eyes too bright. "What are you doing in my room, Lena?" I turned, heart slamming against my ribs. I grabbed his hoodie at the collar and shoved him against the wall. I was furious, ready to hit him. "What the hell is this, Ryan? What have you done?" He broke into a laugh. "You always knew me," he said, his grin wide enough to look painful. "They never did. If they would have paid more attention, they would have noticed I was up to something." I tightened my grip and demanded an answer, but he only laughed harder until a scream ripped through the house. One short, awful sound from downstairs. I let go and ran. The kitchen was a scene from a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Mom was on the floor first, body jerking, foam spilling from her mouth. Dad staggered beside her, eyes wide and unfocused, choking on air that wouldn't come. The smell of chemical bitterness mixed with dinner. I dropped beside them, hands useless, trying to hold them upright as they convulsed. My breath came in gasps that felt like knives. Behind me, Ryan's footsteps were slow and deliberate. His laugh grew louder, a cracked sound that filled the room until it drowned everything else. He leaned against the doorframe, watching our parents die as if he were watching a show he had paid to see. I snatched the phone, fingers shaking, and shouted our address to the 911 operator. Words blurred in my ears. I pressed my back to the wall and kept my eyes on Ryan. He never looked away from me, his grin fixed, his chest rising and falling like nothing had happened. Red and blue lights finally splashed across the windows. Officers kicked the door open. Ryan raised his hand slowly, still smiling. "Happy Halloween, Lena." The sound of his voice cut through the chaos as they dragged him out. Mom and Dad died before the ambulance left our driveway. The police told me Ryan had been buying chemicals for months, testing doses, planning the timing down to the minute. They used words like disturbed and calculated, but none of those words fit the kid I used to know. Neighbors avoid our house now. I keep replaying the dinner table in my head, wondering if I could have stopped it when he laughed the first time. Every memory of him before that year feels fake, like photos from someone else's family. Halloween used to mean costumes and candy. Now it's the night I learned that someone you love can sit across a table smiling while everything you trust rots from the inside.
My name's Oliver Scott. And before I begin the story of Halloween night in 1994, West Hollywood, California, I'd first like you to know, to tell this story of Halloween night and truly capture the horrors it entails, anyone listening would first have to disregard everything they believe and accept a new reality. A reality that things we feared as children, the things we heard about in ghost stories, and the things we eventually grew to believe were make-believe, are in fact as real as you and I, but are simply so terrifying that, over time, the world has chosen to believe they're not. The date was October 31st, 1994. And just like every year before that in West Hollywood, California, excitement and buzz had filled the air, building up for days and weeks, all in anticipation of what would be the best time of our lives. The final night of Halloween. There must have been like 6 different parties going on that night, but my friend Martin had managed to get us invites to the Grimsley Estate party, which was insane at the time because not only was the party thrown at the huge Grimsley Manor up in Beverly Hills, but everyone knew it had the best people, costumes, and vibes you could ask for at a Halloween party. Martin called around 8 p.m. to tell me he and my other friends, Jacob and Randy, were headed to pick me up at 9 p.m. So I took a quick shower, threw on my costume as Eric Draven from The Crow, and lit a cigarette while waiting on the porch for the guys to arrive. The van pulled into my driveway at exactly 9 p.m. that night, and as I stood up to get in the back of the van, Martin quickly stuck his hand out the window and hit the cigarette out of my hand before saying, "Come on, man, you already know I hate when you smoke around me. No way you're bringing that shit into my van." I simply laughed and got into the van, as it wasn't the first time he'd done that, and I honestly didn't care as I just wanted to get to the party without ruining the mood. The 3 of them had gone with pretty basic costumes that night. Martin went as Jason from Friday the 13th, Jack as Michael Myers, and Randy as Freddy Krueger. "Damn, you guys should have told me it was a masked party. I would have chosen a different costume," I said jokingly. After 20 minutes of jokes and getting hyped for the party, everyone stopped in silence as we arrived at the massive gates of the Grimley Estate. 2 men stood at the gate to check invitations, and after that, we drove slowly into the estate and toward the huge white mansion sitting in the middle of it, with loud music, flashing lights, and the sound of partying teenagers filling the air. We stopped the van not too far from the Grimsley mansion, and stepping down was like stepping into another world. The house was massive, 3 stories with high windows that seemed to go on forever, and enough land that you could probably get lost just walking around the property. The driveway alone was big enough to fit a dozen cars, and the whole thing looked more like a hotel than a home. It had those tall white columns you only see in old money estates, and while the estate itself was eerily dark, the house was lit up so bright it almost felt like daylight. We walked into the house around 9:45 p.m., and after about 20 minutes of standing around and getting drinks, the guys and I eventually split up. I ended up meeting a girl named Darla in one of the upstairs rooms. The both of us instantly hit it off, and we spent the rest of the party drinking, dancing, and just having a good time. Eventually, I needed to use the bathroom but had no idea where to go, so I asked, "Hey, I gotta use the bathroom. You know where it is?" She nodded and said, "Yeah, there's 3 downstairs and 2 up here, but those ones probably have lines, so it'd be smart to head downstairs." I raised an eyebrow a little confused by how well she seemed to know the place. "You come here a lot?" I asked. "Well, I guess you could say that. I'm Darla Grimsley. This is my house." The revelation at the time was pretty surprising to me, but I didn't want to make it weird, so I simply responded by saying, "That's cool. Well, I'm going to find that bathroom now," before heading downstairs to find my friends. The party was in full swing by then. Lights were flashing, the music was loud, and everyone was drunk and in costumes, making it almost impossible for me to pick anyone out of the crowd. After a while, I gave up on trying to find my friends and decided I'd meet up with them later, heading to a quieter section of the house where I assumed the bathrooms would be. Instead, I ended up in a long hallway that had multiple doors lining both sides. What really caught my attention, however, was a huge wooden door at the end of the hall. It looked ancient, with all of these strange markings carved into it. Nothing too extraordinarily creepy, but weird enough to draw my attention even more. Now, I don't know what it was, but something about the door or whatever was behind it just pulled me toward it, and without even thinking, I placed my hand on the large metal knob to open it. Right then I heard Darla's voice interrupt from behind. "That's not the bathroom." I turned around in confusion as I couldn't understand why I even tried opening the door in the first place. Darla then proceeded to walk toward me in the door, and I smiled awkwardly before telling her, "Yeah, I'm sorry, I think I got a little lost. Just couldn't find a bathroom." She took my hand and replied, "Well, you definitely don't want to go in there. Come on, I'll show you where to go." After that, we went back upstairs. I used the bathroom, and then I spent the rest of my time at the party with Darla before deciding it was time to leave around midnight. The guys and I had agreed we'd leave the first Halloween party at midnight, as we had planned to head out to another party and meet up with the rest of our friends. I said goodbye to Darla and headed downstairs to the van, but surprisingly, no one else was outside when I got there. I figured they were still inside, so I headed back into the house and decided to wait on the couch next to the door until they were done. After 5 minutes of waiting, however, the three of them emerged from the hallway with the wooden door, and I waved for them to meet me outside as I assumed they'd want to say goodbye to some people, and I wasn't really feeling the need to hang around. The ride to the next house was oddly quiet for some reason, and while at first I tried making conversation, asking about their night, it was obvious none of them were in the mood for small talk, so I realized there was no point. All three of them had their masks on since we left the party. Martin and Jack, who were both sat up front, remained silent, eyes fixed on the road, and Randy, who was at the back with me, was just sitting there staring at nothing. I assumed their bad mood meant they weren't up for the next party we were headed to, so I said, "Hey, if you guys aren't up for the next one, we could always just go home." None of them reacted to what I said, and after that, I decided I didn't really care what their issue was. So I leaned back, rested my head on the van, and lit a cigarette to smoke while we drove in silence. The drive to the next party was taking longer than expected, and when I looked at my watch, I noticed we'd been on the road for almost 30 minutes, and the next party was only supposed to be 6 minutes away. I can't tell if I was starting to sober up or if it was something else, but I suddenly began to notice a few things that made everything feel off. For starters, none of my friends had moved or said a single word for the entire ride. Randy especially stood out as he hadn't taken his eyes off the wall of the van the whole time. Another thing was they'd mentioned earlier that night that the masks made it hard to breathe after a while, but none of them had taken them off since we'd left the party 30 minutes earlier. Despite this, however, the most bizarre thing that almost confirmed my suspicions that night was when I realized I had just smoked 2 whole cigarettes in the back of Martin's van, and he didn't say a word. That was when it really clicked. Whoever those people in the van with me were, they weren't my friends. As I started to wrap my head around the nightmare I was in, my mind raced with a million questions, trying to make sense of what the hell was going on. Panic was creeping in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew the smartest thing to do was to keep it cool, pretend I didn't know what was really happening. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep that up forever. At some point, I'd have to act, as I had no idea who those people were or where they'd been taking me for the past half an hour. I looked out the window and noticed we'd gotten farther away from the city, with barely any lights outside. It hit me that if they took me wherever they were headed, I wouldn't stand a chance against all 3 of them. So I mustered up whatever courage I had in the moment and got up, moving towards the 2 guys in the front. "Hey man, I need to pee really quick. Can we stop here?" I said after tapping the driver's shoulder. He kept driving with no reaction, eyes fixed on the road like I hadn't said a word. My throat began closing up as fear gripped me, but I forced myself to get the next words out. "Dude, I said I need to pee. Pull over." Again, no reaction, and at that point, I knew whoever they were, they had no intention of letting me out. I remained standing between the 2 imposters at the front, and after getting no sign of a response from either of them, I did the only thing I could do and said a quick prayer before grabbing onto the steering wheel, struggling with the driver and forcing the van off the road. The van slammed jarringly, and I was thrown back into the rear end, hitting my head hard on the floor. My skull felt bruised from the impact, and I felt a sharp sting from a cut on my head. Airbags weren't exactly standard at the time, so I had no idea what had happened to the 2 guys up front. All I knew was I had to get out of there, and fast. Getting up wasn't easy as my head was banging. There was a constant ringing around me, and I could barely walk. Still, I managed to stumble out the back of the van and noticed we were just leaving the city limits, about 1 kilometer into the forest. My breath was short and my vision blurred as I began walking towards the city. Before I could make any real distance, though, I felt something cold and tight grip on my leg. I looked down to the horrific sight of who I thought was Martin holding on to me. But it wasn't Martin. Both his legs were broken so badly I could see the bones sticking out, and his other arm lay on the floor a few feet away, surrounded by a trail of some thick liquid he had dragged with him from the wreck. He looked up at me, and I stepped back in horror as the broken mask revealed some sort of creature underneath. Its face was an extremely dark green, covered in slime, and its eyes, or at least what should have been his eyes, were brown orbs covered in scales, fixed on me. The creature opened its mouth to let out a terrible screech while reaching for me. In pure shock, I stepped back hurriedly and fell to the ground. Nothing about this made sense to me. I could barely breathe, but all I could think was, what the hell is that thing? And how exactly I was going to escape when I could barely walk. My eyes remained fixed on the creature crawling toward me, but out of the corner of my eye, I noticed another one walk out of the back of the van before approaching me slowly. The thing had a limp, and its mask was completely gone, revealing the horrific-faced creature I had seen earlier that night. At that point, I was in total panic, and no matter how hard I tried to get up, I just couldn't move. So I accepted my fate, laid back on the cold floor, and waited for the horror movie to come to an end. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a car's bright headlights lit up the whole area. After stopping on the road beside me, I could hear footsteps approach before lifting me and helping me towards the car. Confused, I looked back as I didn't understand why the creature hadn't killed me. But shockingly, they were both gone. The destroyed van, as well as the trail of liquid from earlier, were still in place, but the two creatures had completely vanished, as if they had never been there. Whoever had saved me gently placed me into the backseat of the car, and when I turned to see who it was, I was shocked to see Darla shut the door and head to the driver's seat. Honestly, at the time, I couldn't decide if I was dead, hallucinating, or losing my mind, but in the 20-minute ride that night, Darla assured me I was very much alive before revealing the chilling secrets of Halloween night and what I had just witnessed. See, according to Darla, decades ago before October 31st became Halloween, it used to be a sacred day when all people who practiced the occult would meet up and offer sacrifices to their respective deities. It was believed that after the rituals during the day, demons and creatures of the night would roam among them all night, so believers would have to paint their faces or wear masks in order to blend in and avoid being possessed. Over time, however, witchcraft was slowly cracked down on, and as a result, a few occult families came up with the idea of Halloween and presented it to the community. They claimed it'd be a way for history to replace the dreadful day with something celebratory, but the reality is far darker than that. The purpose of this so-called celebration is simply to disguise what they were doing, and to this day, Halloween is still a sacred day for the occult worshippers, only this time, no one knows who they are or what demons roam among us at night. Darla went on to reveal that her family had been involved in the occult for generations, and the Halloween party was the method for sacrifices to be given without suspicion. That being said, she explained my friends had been sacrificed the moment they walked behind the wooden door, and the creatures I had seen that night were demons that had taken over their bodies, probably planning on eating me or using me for something unspeakable. The more she spoke, the more my mind raced, struggling to process the horror of everything I had been through. I remember my whole body trembling in fear, and once we got to the hospital, we told them I had been in a car accident, and they admitted me for treatment overnight. The next day was the worst day of my life. Martin, Randy, and Jack were all declared missing, and I watched in silence as their parents prayed and searched, desperate for answers for years to follow. I couldn't say anything, and I wasn't going to. The memory of that night and my friends continued to haunt me for years, but eventually, something changed. Over time, Darla's presence in my life became more than just a reminder of that horrific night. She was the only one who understood the weight I carried, and we got married 2 years after the incident. Even though the nightmares never truly stopped, Darla always knew how to soothe me, as if she had a strange hold over me. Now, years later, with graying hair and a tired heart, I find myself telling this story, not to warn you, but to confess. You see, the demons didn't stop after that night. Every Halloween they came back, and it was Darla who ensured me they were fed. I kept quiet because I loved her and her family, and maybe a part of me was afraid if I didn't help her, they'd come for me too. So every year we choose new faces behind masks. And although she's dead now, and I am old, it's my turn to tell you this. On the night of Halloween, be wary of what you do. Lock your doors and avoid the faces behind the masks. Please know, I do not give this warning out of sympathy, but because tonight, you're part of the story.